We're back now with our political panel. Jerry Seib is the executive Washington editor for the Wall Street Journal, and Shawna Thomas is the Washington bureau chief for Vice News. Out in the field this morning, our CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, who is still out at the Iowa State Fair. Ed, tell me, you've been listening to all the candidates out there speak about promising some kind of gun control, either now or if they're elected. Is there any chance any of it gets through?
You know, Margaret, I've been covering this issue in one way or another for 6 or 7 years, since Sandy Hook, essentially. We go through a week of this, we hit a weekend, and then it struggles to sustain itself, the debate. And that's one of the things I'm very curious to watch in the next few days, is can this issue get into its second week since a big mass shooting and sustain itself? And there's some evidence that, at least here in Iowa, a critical early caucus state, that it might. Just a little while ago, Julian Castro, one of the candidates who spends a lot of time here, said that this Wednesday he'll be holding a forum with members of that organization that held the larger forum yesterday here in Des Moines to talk specifically about his gun violence plan and ways to somehow curb violence across the country. It'll happen in a small bedroom community that is popular with younger families, young couples out in eastern Iowa. If that organization can continue to hold those kinds of events with candidates over the course of the next 6 months here and in New Hampshire and in South Carolina and other states, maybe it does sustain itself. But when that congressional debate happens in September, if it happens at all, I suspect it's going to look very similar to what's happened before. Promises of action that fall apart over the details and the concerns from either party that they may be giving away too much.
Shawna, our CBS News polling shows that there is some data to back up what the candidates are saying in terms of shifting public sentiment. 6 out of 10 Democrats polled by CBS say they want things like background checks. Majority of Republicans and Democrats are open to more action on this front. But what's different this time is always the question.
I think that's a good question. It is really hard not to be a little bit cynical. Sandy Hook, 20 kids died. They weren't able to do all of that much afterwards. I think the difference is, one, the NRA doesn't have as much money as they used to. And two, there are Republicans who are trying to engage in this conversation. There's only so many times people can die. And I do think the president saying, okay, let's talk about background checks. Now, we don't know if he's going to actually follow through with that. Always hard to tell with this president. And then hearing McConnell say on the radio, Senator Majority Leader Mitch McConnell say on the radio, okay, we can maybe have this conversation when we come back. At least that's happening. But remember, when Manchin and Toomey had their bill that was a smaller bill about background checks, after Sandy Hook, there were 4 Republicans who voted for it in the Senate. 2 of those Republicans are not in the Senate anymore. So the question is, how much money does the NRA raise out of this, and how scared are Republicans to actually have this conversation?
And we didn't hear from Congressman Scalise, who is the whip, really any promise of anything that would be voted for. He seemed to say there are a lot of tools already there. They just need to be used better by law enforcement.
Yeah, so I think the question is very much open. Will attention stay on this issue, as Ed suggested, or does the circus move on to the next town? One of the things that might be different, to your point, is that for years and years, the passion on the gun issue was on the pro-gun side, not the people who favor gun control. People who wanted guns are more passionate about that issue than the other side. That might have switched in 2018. I think we'll find out now for sure whether that's the case or not. But this is not really a complicated equation. This comes down to 2 men. This comes down to President Trump and to Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate. He says he will not bring up a bill on the Senate that the president won't sign. So will the president convince people he wants a background bill that he will sign? That's the only question that really matters, in a sense.
Sorry, Ed, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that is different is this overlay of racial politics as well. The fact that the killer in El Paso said he specifically went to target Mexicans, and that this was the largest attack on the Latino community this country has ever seen. Does that overlay of a hate crime change things?
I think it does to some extent, especially because it happened in such a border community that is defined by its Latino heritage, and the fact, frankly, that one of the presidential candidates is from there, Beto O'Rourke. He was able to help draw even more attention to this, perhaps, than it would have gotten otherwise. There's been a lot of debate in the past week about, is this just a gun debate, or does this also have to be a conversation about the fact that this was the largest anti-Latino attack, essentially, in modern history? And I've talked to some colleagues, and I asked Julian Castro the other day when he was here whether or not he thought the nation's response had been proper. He thought to some extent it had, but I got a sense from him that perhaps it could have been a little stronger, or there could have been more conversation about that. But I think it absolutely helps fuel the conversation, because race is, will be, and probably should continue to be part of the conversation in this campaign, given the fact that you have so many historic candidates running, given that the Democratic Party continues to have this debate over where exactly it should be campaigning for votes in order to win back the White House. Do you focus on southern states with younger and more minority populations? Do you come back to here in the Midwest and try to drive up the numbers among white working class voters? Although if you were to come to Iowa, you'd find a growing percentage of Latino people here. So it's an argument that has a double relevance, certainly over the past week, and candidates knew that.
Shawna, Joe Biden had a few missteps this week. Steve Scalise, in this interview on our show, hit him on a few of those things. But one of them was also, he seemed to say something to the effect of poor kids are just as good as white kids. The right jumped on him for that.
Yeah, and here's the deal. Joe Biden is an older person, and sometimes he is going to say things that sound like mistakes. That is something that he and his campaign are going to have to deal with, because in the world we currently live in, with social media, 24-hour cable news, everything else, every little thing you do is going to be under a microscope, and Republicans are going to jump on him for that. I think it is clear what he was trying to say. I don't think he was trying to, in any way in this type of commentary, be racist or anything like that, but this is a problem they're going to have to continue to deal with, and it's going to happen in debates. He's just going to have to figure out how to speak a little bit more carefully.
Jerry, when you look at what happened this week in the escalation of the trade war, there are some Republicans who are nervous that the president is hurting his chances at re-election if his bet does not pay off.
Well, it's an interesting situation, because this is actually an issue, the trade fight with China in particular, where the president has some bipartisan support. Chuck Schumer's warning to the president a few months ago was, don't go soft on China. So up to this point, he's got a lot of Republican support, a fair amount of business community support, and some Democratic support. But a lot of that support is basically premised on the idea that the trade wars will be temporary and that they'll be contained. And this is the week where I think it started to look as if, wait, this might get out of control and it might go on for a long time. And I think some people who are with the president now on trade didn't sign up for a long trade war. They signed up for a short tariff fight. And if that's not what it is, I think it becomes very problematic for the president, or at least potentially so.
And those farmers in Iowa want to know what the future holds for them. I mean, we've talked to a lot of farmers in Iowa on Vice News who are basically saying, okay, I'm willing to go with the president because I do think we need to stand up to China. But if I don't have some consistency soon, I don't know how to make decisions about my business, and I'm going to lose money. And that's scary.
And it's interesting that if you look at the numbers, the trade deficit actually went up in the first 6 months of this year. It's bigger now. It's 8% bigger than it was a year ago. So you have to ask the question, is this working? Is this trade war working? We're supposed to bring the trade deficit down. So I think it's a very tricky time. We may be at a bit of an inflection point for President Trump on the trade issue.
It's something we'll watch. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to Ed out in Iowa.